Hello, welcome to Radical Engagements, and we are continuing our long slog through Read on Authority by JudgeSabo. Last time we covered the Yara Federation's definition of authority and its backing up of Bakunin, and a little bit of Malatesta's definition of authority. Now we're going to visit Malatesta's 1879 work, Organization. And JudgeSabo is going to go through it, as well as a few other major pieces by anarchists. This is an exhaustive thing, but it's a good history for the anarchist point of view of the division after the degeneration of the Second International. We'll be coming back to this for a while. We'll also be continuing our series on the Bridiga and the Leon thesis, and I'm going to throw some other stuff out there as well. I feel like these on authority things are really useful, and the people who enjoyed them, but you can't walk into series 11 of what is likely to be a 15 or 16 part cycle that has been stretched out over several months. So, but we're going through this piece by piece. All right. All right, so JudgeSabo has us talking now about Malatesta's 1879 piece Organization. Just like Bakunin's thought should not be taken as representative of all anarchism, neither should Malatesta's or any other individual thinker. There was, within anarchism, competing conceptions about what non-authoritarian relations would look like. This debate is generally characterized as being between the organizationalist and the anti-organizationalist. The anti-organizationalists did not oppose people working together in any sense. Where they argued for smaller and temporary affinity groups and informal social networks to carry large-scale actions. Asterisk. It's a lot like communization theory today, on asterisk. Thus, they still endorse combined action while rejecting organization, or perhaps we might now call institutions. I don't know how these people don't end up being anarcho-individualists, but they don't, and we'll get back to that in a minute. What they opposed was an advocacy for large-scale and more formal federations advocated by the organizationalists, viewing it as hindering individual initiative. Yeah, so these people are veering close to individualist anarchists. This appears to have been a minority view among early anarchists, and largely seems to have come from bad experiences with the First International, thanks to the actions of the General Council. Malatesta was an organizationalist, and in his argument against the anti-organizationalist, we can see him elaborate more on the distinctions he saw between organization and authority in his essay, Organization, which you guys should check out. Long quote from Malatesta. The fundamental error of anarchists opposed to organization is to believe that organization is impossible without authority. And once a hypothesis has been accepted, they would rather give up any organization than accept a modicum of authority. Now, that organization, meaning associations for a specific purpose and adopting the forms and means required in order to achieve that purpose, is a fundamental prerequisite of living in a society, strikes us as self-evident. The isolated man cannot live even the life of a brute. Other than in the tropics, and when the population is exceedingly sparse, he cannot even feed himself, and remains, without exception, incapable of achieving a standard of living any better than the beast, obliged therefore to combine forces with other people and actually finding himself united with them as a result of the prior evolution of the species. He must either defer to the will of others, be a slave, or impose his own will on others, be an authority figure, or live in fraternal agreement with others for the sake of the greater good of all, be a partner. None can escape this need, and the most extravagant anti-organizationers are not only subject to the overall organization of society in which they live. Asterisk is Varn talking. You live in a society, says clown sad Dorno, on asterisk. But even in the purposeful acts in their own lives, in their wrangles with organization, they come together and share the tasks and organize together with those of like mind and employ the means that society places at their disposal, provided, of course, that these things are generally wanted and enacted rather than just vague platonic aspirations and dreams dreamt. Unquote. Malatesta here identifies combined action not merely as a requirement for a modern factory, but even for the most basic kind of society with very rare exceptions for survival. An asterisk, I would say Malatesta is actually accurate that to live alone as a self-sufficient human being actually requires very few other human beings in your vicinity, because your productive capacity diminishes significantly, and you have to have pretty steady abundance of natural life, funkant national life, you might say, to be able to do that. And most people and most times and places in human history have not lived that way, which is why we evolved socially, or at least is one of the reasons. Malatesta recognizes that people can combine forces in different ways. In authoritarian relations, this relation between an authority figure and a slave. This is understood in contrast to a fraternal and mutually beneficial agreement between partners. Authority is not defined with combined action as such. See, this is one of the things implied by one of Engels' sub-definitions, that all combined action is a form of authority. While Malatesta does describe it as something imposed rather than, while the other one defers. This is not merely someone acquiescing to the request of another. Something is being imposed in a way distinct from merely coming to an agreement. Thus, we have a distinction between authority and free agreement, and this distinction even the anti-organizers would recognize. This feeds into his view of anarchy, which builds in the distinction between imposing one's wishes and voluntarily working with others and following the advice of experts. Quote, anarchy signifies society organized without authority, authority being understood as the ability to impose one's wishes and not the inescapable and beneficial practice whereby the person who best understands and is most knowledgeable about the doings of something finds it easier to have his opinions heeded, and in that specific instant serves as a guide for those less capable. Anarchism is not totally anti-expert, at least according to Bakunin and Malatesta. Now, anarchism is, of course, more contested than even Marxism, so take that with a grain of salt. But, as far as what the classical anarchists thought on the anarcho-collectivist and the anarcho-communist side, it's pretty clear here. He later elaborates on this, identifying authority with coercion, indicating that what is being imposed here is coercively imposed, presumably through the same methods that he had included in his essay Anarchy, i.e. physical, economic, and intellectual social power. That last one's a little vague, but nonetheless. Malatesta recognizes the possibility of making this distinction as fundamental to anarchism itself, because otherwise anarchists would have need to oppose any sort of social organizing which is necessary for human life itself. Long quote from Malatesta. As we see, authority is not only not a prerequisite of social organization, but far from fostering it, it is a parasite upon it, hindering its evolution and siphoning off the advantages for the special benefit of a getting class that exploits and oppresses the West. As long as a harmony of interests exists within the community, as long as no one is inclined or equipped to exploit others, there is no trace of authority. Once internal strife comes and the community is broken down into winners and losers, then authority arises, being naturally vested in the stronger and helping it to confirm, perpetuate, and magnify their victory. This is what we believe, and this is why we are anarchists. If instead we believe that organization without authority is unfeasible, we would rather be authoritarians, for we would prefer authority, which troubles and such existence, to the disorganization that renders it impossible. It's better to be alive and subordinated than not alive at all, but better not either, according to Malatesta. Authority here is once again associated with class rule, where one set of people are privileged and which exploits and oppresses the rest. Non-authoritarian relations are also marked by a harmony of interest in our relations and an absence of exploitation. Malatesta concedes that if the time for the distinction were not recognized, it would be impossible to do something like run a railroad without authority. Quote, besides, how things have turned out for us is of little account. If it were true that the engineer and the engineer driver and the station master simply had to be authorities rather than partners performing certain tasks on everybody's behalf, the public would still rather defer to their authority than make the journey on foot. If there was no option but for the postmaster to be an authority, everyone in his right mind would put up with the postmaster's authority rather than deliver his own letters, in which case anarchy would be the stuff of some people's dreams, but can never become reality. Well, a lot of people say it can't ever become reality, but nonetheless. From here, Malatesta considers more critiques of anti-organizationalists. such as the ways in which absence of organization actually increases the ability of authoritarian individuals to impose themselves on others. But this is mostly irrelevant to our discussion of Engels. For now, it is enough to recognize that anarchists, including the anti-organizationalists, had not rejected combined action as such, even when there was a debate over what the proper form in free society should look like. Other examples, asterisk, I'm assuming from the anarchist tradition, an asterisk. Much space has been given to rather detailed analysis of a few offers. I believe the views presented here by Bakunin, the Yar Federation, and Malatesta are largely consistent with the broader anarchist movement, asterisk, at least in the 19th and early 20th century. That's Varn talking on asterisk. But it can be useful to briefly consider several other examples from anarchists around the world to demonstrate this consistently. Here I intend to be brief, to briefly consider select quotes from other early anarchists that seem to express similar views. To begin, the French geographer Elisée Reclus presents his familiar idea of authority in his essay Anarchy, 1894. Quote, the sacrosanct system of domination encompasses a long succession of superimposed classes in which the highest level has the right to command and the lowest has the duty to obey. The official morality consists in bowing humbly to one's superiors and is proudly holding up one's head before one's subordinates. Each person must have, like Janus, two faces with two smiles, one flattering, solicitous, and even servile, and the other haughty and nobly condescending. The principle of authority, which is the proper name for this phenomenon, demands that the superior should never give the impression of being wrong, and that in every verbal exchange he should have the last word, and above all, his orders must be carried out. This simplifies everything. There is no need for quibbling, explanations, hesitations, discussions, or misgivings. Things move along all by themselves, for better or worse. And if the master isn't around to command in person, one really has ready-made formulas, orders, decrees, laws handed down from absolute masters and legislators on various levels. These formulas substitute for the direct orders, and one can follow them without having to consider whether or not they are in accord with one's inner voice of one's conscience. Between equals, the task is more difficult, but also more exalted. We must search fiercely for truth, discover our own personal duty, learn to know ourselves, engage continually in our own education, and act in ways that respect the rights and interests of our comrades. Only then can one become a truly moral being. There's this emphasis on an anarchism on morality that's really interesting to me, because it implies that there's a universal morality. And I'm not so sure. I think there might be your universal moral inclinations or kernels the human beings have, fairness being one of them, etc. But I'm not sure that there's a universal morality beyond those kind of vague, nebulous inclinations. Those inclinations are enough to give one gust of morality, I guess, but it's not really worked out, and most societies work it out in tandem. Whereas these ideas of the fully moral person that you hear in all these anarchist talks seem to just think that that's obvious. Marxists don't think it's obvious, and that's one of the major differences between us and anarchists. Although some Marxists take it too far, implying that there's no morality at all, or almost in a Nietzschean sense, morality is just a will of rule. All right. And awaken to a feeling of responsibility. Morality is not command to which one submits, a word which one repeats, something purely external to the individual. It must become part of one's being, the very product of one's life. I mean, I kind of agree with that, but I don't agree that it's universal or obvious. This is a way we anarchists understand morality. Are we not justified in comparing this conception favorably with the one bequeathed to us by our ancestors? Authority here is presented as a right to command, paired with a similar duty of a subordinate to obey. Reclusus decries this, how the conception of the principle of authority shapes each party's character, behavior, and conception of morality. Yeah, I mean, I do see the problem there. This is contrasted with the anarchist system between equals, where we gain a better and more honest respect for ourselves and others. But Reclusus, while condemning authority, also makes sure to contrast this definition of authority from other potential definitions. This can also be seen in his essay, The Modern State, from 1905. Finally, we're in the 20th century. Just as property is the right of use and abuse, so is authority the right of command, rightly or wrongly. This is understood well by the masters and also by the governed, whether they slavishly obey or feel the spirit of rebellion awakening. Philosophers have viewed authority quite differently, desiring to give this word a meaning closer to its original one, which implied something like creation, they tell us that authority resides in everyone who teaches someone else about something useful, and that it applies to everyone from the most celebrated scholar to the humblest mother. Still, none of them go so far as to consider the revolutionary who stands up to power as a true representative of authority. Everyone has a right to speak the language that they want to speak, and to give the words the meaning which they have personally chosen. But it is certain that, in the popular discourse, the word authority does have the same meaning as that given to it by Poseidon commanding to the tempest. And thus I order, no reason my will suffice. So the masters never talked any other way. It is established that the quote creation is the canon is the reason of kings. And isn't the raison d'etre distinguished precisely because it is not reason? It places itself outside of vulgar humanity. It commands the just and unjust, the good and evil as it wishes. Authority, once again, is presented as a right to command, similar to the right of property, and is backed up ultimately by violence. The reason of kings: all authority is to be denounced, but it is to be done while clarifying against those who identify authority as, quote, anyone who teaches someone else something useful. So we have a separation of authority here, of its different uses in language, which Ingalls had conflated. I mean, that's undeniable that Ingalls conflated it. The rebel resisting that imposition is not trying to do the same thing to the rulers as if the two kings were struggling for one throne, but resistance to authority itself. Recluse explicitly defends the anarchist use of authority as something matching the popular usage of the term, including how it is used by the authorities themselves. The anarchist meaning of authority is technical and should not be confused with other meanings or uses of the word, but it is also rooted in already existing widespread uses. The American black anarchist Lucy Parsons' lecture, The Principles of Anarchism, 1905 to 1910, gives the following definition of anarchy. Absence of government, disbelief in and disregard of invasion and authority based on coercion and force, a condition of society regulated by voluntary agreement instead of government. Anarchy, again, is described as opposed to authority, which is inherently connected to coercion or force, contrasted to a system of free and voluntary agreements. Asterisk. Isn't that what people argue that liberalism is? On asterisk. Parsons argues that anarchism, by arguing for the removal of the impediments to progress through intellectual development by science and the removal of physical barriers like property and the physical brutality of the state. Instead, things will be controlled by people who use them, i.e., what John Locke said but never did. Just going to point that out. There is a relationship between modern anarchism and liberalism that needs to be further extrapolated on. Long quote. Vested rights, privileges, charters, title deeds upheld by all paraphernalia of the government, the invisible symbol of power, such as prisons, scaffold, and armies, will have no existence. There can be no privileges bought or sold, and the transactions kept sacred at the point of the bayonet. Every man will have an equal footing with his brother in the race of life, and neither chains of economic thraldom nor menial drugs of superstition shall handicap one to the advantage of the other. Property will lose a certain attribute which sanctifies it now. The absolute ownership of it, the right to use or abuse, will be abolished, and possession, use, will be the only title. It will be seen now how impossible it would be for one person to own 1 million acres of land without a title deed backed by a government ready to protect it, the title at all hazards, even to the loss of thousands of lives. He could not use 1 million acres himself, nor could he wrest from its depth the possible resources it contains. You might be able to now, Lucy, but the rest of that's true. People have become so used to seeing evidence of authority on every hand that most of them honestly believe they would go utterly to the bad if it were not for the policeman's club or the soldier's bayonet. But the anarchists say, remove these evidence of brute force and let men feel the reviving influences of self-responsibility and self-control and see how well he will respond to the better influences. There's a clear similarity here in those forms of domination identified, as we saw in Malatesta, regarding intellectual, economic, and physical coercion. The Russian-American anarchist Emma Goldman described anarchism similarly as well. With regard to different dominions in her essay, Anarchism, What It Really Stands For, in 1910, she also contrasts this to the order that would be created by free grouping and collective ownership. Quote from Goldman, anarchism then really stands for the liberation of the human mind from the dominion of religion, liberation of the human body from the dominion of property, liberation from the shackles and restraints of government. Anarchism stands for the social order based on the free grouping of individuals for the purposes of producing real social wealth, an order that will guarantee to every human being free access to the earth and full employment of the necessities of life according to individual desires, tastes, and inclinations. Unquote. Goldman believed the anarchism could only be achieved through revolution. She saw this revolution as primarily coming from the strength of the working class organizing and syndicalist labor unions. Asterisk. People need to. There's been a recent trend, even amongst Marxists, to not understand the difference between cancelists and syndicalists. I just want to point this out because syndicalists are actually only organizing the firm, and they don't feel like the rest of life needs to be organized, which implies some kind of market. Whereas councilists do not agree. Building up its strength by exercising direct action against authority, with one of its ultimate tools being the general strike. See Kautsky's critique of the general strike, are the implicit critique of it and Sorel's adoption of it, which actually agrees with Kautsky. Long quote from Goldman. In France and Spain, in Italy and Russia, and even in England, witness to the growing rebellion of English labor unions, direct revolutionary economic action has become a strong force in the battle for industrial liberty, as to make the world realize the tremendous importance of labor's power. The general strike, the supreme expression of economic consciousness of the workers, was ridiculed in America but a short time ago. Asterisk is still ridiculed because it never actually happens worldwide in a way that actually stops capital enough to have revolutionary change. But nonetheless, I get why we still have to talk about it. Today, every great strike, in order to win, must realize the importance of the solidaristic general protest. Direct action, having proved effective along economic lines, is equally potent in the environment of the individual. There are hundreds of forces that encroach upon his being, and the only persistent resistance to them will finally set him free. Direct action against authority in the shop, direct action against authority of the law, direct action against authority of the invasive, meddlesome authority of a moral code is logical, consistent method of anarchism. Will it not lead to revolution? Asterisk, it kind of did, but didn't. On asterisk, indeed it will. I mean, maybe. So far, not really. No real change has ever come about without a revolution. I want to say this, even as a person who believes that revolutions are necessary and sometimes a given, I don't think it's true. To make all real change come about through revolution is to make revolution almost a metaphor. All right, that's all. People are either not familiar with their history or they have not yet learned that revolution is but carried out into action. The Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin describes anarchism as similarly opposed to authority. He began his submission on anarchism to the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1910 like this. Anarchism, from the Greek an and archos, contrary to authority. The name given to a principle or theory of life, conduct under which society is conceived by a government. Harmony in such a society being obtained not by submission to law, but by obedience or by obedience to any authority, but by free agreements concluded between various groups, territorial and professional, freely constituted for the sake of production and consumption, as also for the satisfaction of the infinite variety of needs and aspirations of a civilized being. We see once again anarchy being described as contrary to authority, which means here that there is no obedience to any authority, which is in contrast to a system of free agreement. The Russian-American anarchist Alexander Bergman as well connects this idea to the authority to force and violence. This can be seen in his book Now and After, The ABCs of Communist Anarchism from 1929. Aha. Now under 100 years ago. Quote, what is this thing we call government? Is it anything but organized violence? Asterisk Weber said that too. It's been obvious forever. On asterisk. The law orders you to do this or not to do that, and if you fail to obey, it will compel you by force. We are not to discuss now whether or not it is right or wrong, whether or not it should or should not be so. Just now that we are interested in the fact that it is so, that all government, all law and authority finally rest on force and violence, on punishment or fear of punishment. Why? Even spiritual authority, authority of the church and God, rests on force and violence because it is feared the divine wrath and vengeance that wields power over you, that compels you to obey, or even to believe against your own reason. Asterisk, so many of these have a Christian view of religion. An asterisk. Whenever you turn, you will find our entire life is built upon violence and the fear of it. Yes, it is. And from the earliest childhood, you are subjected to the violence of parents or elders. At home, in school, in the office, factory, field, or shop, it is always someone's authority which keeps you obedient and compels you to do his will. The right to compel you is called authority. Fair punishment has been made into a duty and is called obedience. Unquote. Again, we have authority presented as the basis on force and violence, extending only to the law, but also to the church and factories. Authority, in fact, and to the church by symbolic punishment if you don't actually believe God is real. And sometimes it's a real punishment too, but they don't always have the ability to do that. Authority is also characterized here as something being fixed as a right, especially as a right to compel you. The kind of authority is reaffirmed when Berger summarizes the idea of communist anarchism. Long quote. Politically, then, man will encompass no authority which can force or coerce him. Government shall be abolished. Economically, he will permit no exclusive possession of the sources of life in order to preserve his opportunity of free access. Monopoly of land, private ownership of the machinery of production, distribution, and accumulation can therefore not be tolerated under anarchy. Opportunity to use what one needs in order to live must be free to all. In a nutshell, then, the meaning of the communist anarchism is this: the abolition of government, of coercive authority, and all of its agencies, and joint ownership, which means free and equal participation in the general work and welfare. Unquote. But while Bergman rejects authority, he is still careful to distinguish this from cooperation. Bergman describes the difference between the unhealthy anarchist based upon the subsidiary compulsion, i.e. authority, and healthy one built on voluntary agreement. Long quote. Capitalist society is so badly organized by its various members suffer, just as when you have a pain in some part of you, your whole body aches and you are ill. This is the organization that is painful because it is ill, an organization that is joyous because it means health and strength. As an organization is ill or evil when it neglects or suppresses any of its organs or members. In a healthy organism, all parts are equally valuable and none is discriminated against. The organization built on compulsion, which coerces and forces, is bad and unhealthy. The libertarian organization, formed voluntary and in every member is free and equal, is sound body and can work well. Such organization is a free union of equal parts. It is the kind of organization the anarchists believe in. Unquote. Still, while Bergman has recognized the government authority as a kind of organized violence, he does not identify with all current violence as such. For example, violence is also used by the oppressed in their resistance to the violence of the government, especially as seen within certain stages of revolution. I'm going to actually agree with Engels that that's still a form of authority. It might be a form of authority used to undo authority, right? I'm not saying it's the same as government, but it's a form of authority. Coercion is a form of authority. You can't selectively pick the coercion you need to work and argue that somehow it doesn't count. That's just me. That's the one thing where I think these anarchists are slippery in a way that isn't really justifiable. Organized violence is perhaps most characteristic of the government, though. Yes, it is, since it is establishing and maintaining coercive relations within a coercive society. Anarchy, by contrast, is not marked by this kind of relation. The violence is used is in a response to and resistance of or violence of the state, while anarchy itself is characterized by peace and freedom. The violence that is used in resistance to the government is carried out with this in mind. Long quote. Subquote. Suppose that your system is tried and you have means of defending yourself of the revolution you ask, certainly. Even by armed force, yes, is necessary. But armed force is organized violence. Didn't you say anarchism is against it? Anarchism is opposed to any interference with your liberty, be it by force and violence or by any other means. It is against all invasion and compulsion. But if one attacks you, then it is he who is invading you, and he who is employing violence against you. You have a right to defend yourself. More than that, it is your duty, as an anarchist, to protect your liberty, to resist coercion and compulsion. Otherwise, you are a slave, not a free man. In other words, the social revolution will attack no one, but it will defend itself against invasion from any quarter. It's still a form of authority. But I mean, it's like the least necessary one. Anyway, I mean, it's the most necessary one. I think it's defensible even by anarchist definition, but it seems to me weird to be like, the authority to protect revolution is not a form of authority. Besides, you must not confuse the social revolution with anarchy. Revolution, and some of its slogans, is a violent upheaval. Anarchy is a social condition of freedom and peace. The revolution is the means of bringing anarchy about, but it is not anarchy itself. It is to pave the road for anarchy, to establish the conditions which will make a life of liberty possible. But to achieve its purpose, the revolution must be imbued with and directed by the anarchist spirit and ideas. The end shapes the means, just as the tool you use must be fit to do the work you want to accomplish. That is to say, the social revolution must be anarchistic in method as in aim. Revolutionary defense must be in consonance with the spirit. Self-defense excludes all acts of coercion, of persecution, or revenge. It is concerned only with repelling attack and depriving the enemy of the opportunity to invade you. End quote. Although I've only been able to review a small number of authors, and certainly it would have been added more to have even more material cited here, I hope these selections can be taken as fairly representative of the anarchist movement as a whole, asterisk before the 1970s, where it gets a lot weirder on asterisk, and refer to the general tendencies within these definitions as standard anarchist meaning. Oh boy. Okay, let's just go here. The standard anarchist meaning and definition of authority. The standard anarchist definition of authority. From the above examples, we can see certain common elements in the anarchist understanding of authority. Authority is primarily associated with the imposition of coercive relations, leveraging some form of economic, physical, economic, or intellectual social power as a way to make others carry out their wishes and materially benefit the privileged party. In other words, it is seen in relations marked by domination and exploitation of the oppressed. Its specific type of authority depends on, among other things, the type of social power that is used to compel the compliance of the subordinated party, such as a politician passing laws backed by the physical strength, in the contrast to capitalist managers giving orders backed by their control over key resources as their property. In this respect, authority is held in firm distinction to voluntary relations among our free agreements, such as the advice of experts voluntarily followed. The mark of authority is not mere compliance with the wishes of another, but method through which that compliance is achieved. Because of this, authority is also not identified with organization or administration itself, different from Engels, who clearly does see it as the same thing, since non-authoritarian relations are possible here too. When anarchists have described things like experts or laws of nature as forms of authority, they do not seem to believe that it is something that it is possible for anarchism to oppose or abolish entirely, and must be accepted to some extent, even if somewhat reluctantly. While authority can manifest at an interpersonal level, it is most clear when considered at the social level with certain authoritarian institutions. This manifests as class divisions between rulers and ruled. The specific kind of ruling class they belong to, again, depends on the particular form of social power they specialize in and the way it manifests. E.g., as a prime minister or as a CEO, this privileged position they hold, this power also manifests in the form of a right, imposing those duties among others. By extension, the absence of this kind of class relation is also seen as an absence of authority, removing a hierarchical relation to be replaced with a kind of equity. Equity is especially marked by the kind of leveling achieved in collective ownership of the means of production in the classless system, as well as what might be called a, quote, equality of freedom found in non-domination and the absence of class barriers to opportunity and the establishment of horizontally structured organizations that do not delegate power away from its membership. Authority is also identified as the imposition of this coercive relation, looking to establish, maintain, reinforce, and expand the system of class domination and exploitation, which is contrasted with the resistance to its imposition. Anarchists seem to understand imposing the third sense of the term I have offered here when analyzing Engels' use of the word imposition. Anarchists have recognized a material functional difference tied in it with its class analysis between kinds of violence used in favor of this class division and what is used against it. We have seen this extending even back before the publication of On Authority and Bakunin. Given the above, we can reconstruct a standardized anarchist definition of authority as something like this. Authority is a social relation of domination or exploitation coercively imposed by one party upon to others, claiming a right to command or forbid and exercise some similar privilege backed by the means of physical, economic, or intellectual power. The intellectual power stuff needs to be fleshed out. I don't feel like it's fleshed out here very well, especially when found in a systemic or institutional form. I mean, institutional power is different from intellectual power, though. And when considered in contrast to free agreement, expert advice, or inevitable laws of nature, are the resistance to its imposition. I hope that readers find this definition accurately reflect how authority is described previously. I agree it does, even if I have issues with some of those descriptions. I think that is what anarchists think. We have also seen several ideas discussed, such as the principle of authority, to describe the underlying ideas and justifications for authority based on the masses being incapable of self-management, aka the ideology of statist. While I call this the anarchist definition, it should not be understood as claiming that this definition is unique to anarchists. On the contrary, anarchists defend their use as being the most common sense of the word when people refer to the authorities. I do not mean to imply that all anarchists are in agreement about the nature and definition of authority, only that these are the common features that might find broad acceptance. And that seems true enough. It is also clear from our analysis that anarchists do indeed reject all authority in the relevant sense of the term. However, they have also recognized that there are other senses of the term, broad meanings, which would not be rejected, or at least they do not expect to be abolished even after the anarchist revolution. This can be seen in Bakunin recognizing the legitimate authority of science. Anarchists are not merely reacting to a word as if their position was based on avoiding jargon because it sounds bad. The anarchist position can be expressed without relying on this definition of authority. Anarchists have nonetheless typically adopted this meaning not only for the propagandistic purposes, but for the most easily expressible to its members of the working class, but also because it allows for a more careful distinction in identifying what they fundamentally oppose. We're going to stop this section here so we don't take too long. I think this is a pretty good summary of classical anarchist definitions of authority from the 1880s to the early 20th century. I do think it gets more complicated in the 80s and 90s amongst like post-left anarchists and stuff like national anarchists and stuff like that. But we're not going to talk about that today. And that's beyond the scope of this debate because Engels was not writing for 100 years in the future. Anyway, here we go. We'll be going back to the Engels end of this in the next sections we review.